Not many games in any medium radiate the same power, admiration, or legacy that Silent Hill does. There are only a handful of other series that have had a similar level of impact on me, and judging by the staying power of the series, I'm not really alone here. Silent Hill has been covered to death, but regardless, it always seems someone has something new to say about it. Similarly, another online horror phenomenon seems to have received a similar treatment. Abstract and odd spaces that radiate feelings of nostalgia, melancholy, and even a bit of fight or flight. It's become an unwavering staple of the online horror space. It's just a given at this point that the subject of liminal spaces will inevitably come up anytime someone is discussing horror-related media and subjects. And that's because liminal spaces themselves tend to cut to the heart of most. As simple as it is to chalk them up to simply being images of oddly laid out and decayed places, there's always one that will burrow deep into the psyche. And that's because we've all been exposed to some sort of liminal space in our lives at some point. And for most of us, it was long before any silly names or clickbait YouTube videos were made to try and explain them away. While most people have had their idea of liminality full and welly distorted over the years by the oversaturated and tired meme of the backrooms.
I said your favorite word, the backrooms, okay, the backrooms.
There's far more to the subject than an endless maze of yellowed, damp rooms, and just how much liminality can affect things beyond just simple spaces, like how they can distort the human form, the mind, and even our perception of the world around us. Silent Hill is the perfect series to explore this with, because it's built from the ground up on the idea of liminality, whether that was intentional or not. But that doesn't really matter, because when you dig just beyond the surface of these PlayStation powerhouses, you'll find an endless rabbit hole of concepts, intentions, and psychological fuckery to dig into. There's a reason these games have been covered to death, and that's because not only are they some of the best horror experiences one could indulge in, but because everyone who plays them will find their own connections to make, with unique outlooks and perspectives. Silent Hill is my favorite series, so consider this video a labor of love. But without further ado, let's talk about liminality in Silent Hill.
Who in the hell was that?
It might be a bit of a redundant statement, but Silent Hill 1 really did set the groundwork for how the series would tackle liminality. And while liminal spaces were decades away from being a part of the conversation or even really a passing thought, it's interesting to note that the concept of limin was thrust upon the team rather than being chosen. Now, before we dive headfirst into the rusty, mold-infested rooms of our surreal nightmares, we should probably get acquainted with just what liminality is and what it means. Liminal is derived from the word limen, which roughly translates to threshold, and the definition of the word liminal itself is 1. Psychology of relating to or situated at the limen, the threshold at which a stimulus begins to produce effect. The subject's responses to liminal stimulation derived from some sort of responding and some not. 2. Of or relating to a transitional or intermediate state, stage, or period. Confusion can strike in the liminal states between waking and sleeping. The liminal period between adolescence and adulthood is a challenging place to be. Essentially, liminal translates to the transitional state of a place, and if the secondary definition is anything to go by, it's specifically referring to the intermediary stage where it's becoming less apparent or distinguishable from its original form, to a certain extent even becoming dreamlike. Silent Hill itself exists in a very similar state. The familiar visages of a small East Coast town and the many locations we could expect to see, but each being in an abandoned and disrepaired state, similar to many images that we associate with liminal spaces. But where Silent Hill takes us even deeper is in its exploitation of the idea of duality, or in this case, dual worlds. Simultaneously interconnected and in many ways mirrored, but with the game's otherworld being far more distorted, rusted, and decayed from the one that we are supposed to exist in. To expand on this, we should probably take a look at the basic plot of Silent Hill. The game starts off with our protagonist Harry taking a road trip with his daughter, only for them to see a girl running through the street, causing Harry to swerve and crash outside of the town of Silent Hill, an eerie and haunted location that seems to be abandoned and empty, populated only by a few strange people, a cop named Sybil Bennett, and monstrous creatures who seek to slaughter us. Harry's goal isn't just to escape the town, but also find his missing daughter Cheryl, and discover what's going on with the strange cult that seems to exist in the depths of the town. Now, how does this plot relate to liminality? Well, its entire premise begins with the concept of limen. As we stated, limen translates to threshold, whose definition is 1. A strip of wood, metal, or stone forming the bottom of a doorway and crossed in entering a room. 2. The magnitude or intensity that must be exceeded for a certain reaction, phenomenon, result, or condition to occur or be manifested. The game begins with Harry crossing the threshold of his world into the other world, both figuratively with the car crash, but also with how the game begins. We wake up and explore the town. In real time, we see it shift and change before our eyes. We walk through what seems to be a normal, albeit abandoned neighborhood, only to end up in an alleyway that, as we walk further and further into, transforms. We literally cross the threshold and watch the transition from what once was a normal alleyway as it becomes a dark, rusty, decrepit nightmare. And once we reach the dead end, this happens. We crossed the threshold and experienced the transitional phase. In other words, experiencing limen. And if we look at threshold's secondary definition, it's safe to say that the magnitude and intensity were exceeded to create a reaction in the players and, in the game, manifest a phenomenon. This is the hook and formula for Silent Hill 1. The game is constantly taking us back and forth from the real world to the other world, pushing us back and forth through the threshold, and having us continually experience liminality, all while we see more and more locations that come to fit the modern interpretation of liminal spaces, constantly taking nostalgic and familiar locations like diners, neighborhoods, and schools, and letting us see the abandoned and eerie state that they exist in, before throwing us headfirst into the nightmares distortions of the other world. Another massive aspect of this is the game's use of fog. Funnily enough, the iconic fog the series is famous for wasn't really supposed to be in the game. It was used because it allowed for the team to create a bigger game by sidestepping the limitations of the PlayStation. That's not to say that it was all just an accident though, as a heavy focus of the game's horror is based on the fear of the unknown or cosmic horror, taking direct inspiration from Stephen King's The Mist, a book about a similarly fog-ridden town being overrun by otherworldly creatures, and a story that also tells of a father attempting to save his child from the horrors around him. This is also why Silent Hill 1's creature design is much more insect and bug-like, unlike the other games in the series, but enemy design is something we'll tackle a little later. The fog has a dreamlike quality and allows for the game to feel far less grounded in reality and more so abstract and atmospheric, like a corrupted dreamscape. allowing our constant back and forth between the real and otherworld to be disorienting and surprising. This same technique is also used in the game's music, which uses a lot of everyday sounds and mingles them into pure audio terror. This is apparently a dental drill, and it sounds just as fucking wrong as you can get. And much like the game's other tracks, they do similar things with metals, door creaks, and other found sound, molding it into an industrial, disgusting montage of audio, only having it broken up by silence, and the occasional ambient trip-hop track that gives us some much-needed reprieve. The original Silent Hill is definitely the most traditional liminal space-oriented entry, with its low-poly PS1 graphics helping to directly play into the nostalgic aspect. But as with most things in this series, it's where the groundwork would be laid, setting us up for the many ways the sequels would expand and even more directly fuck with our heads.
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you.
One of the biggest issues with the concept of liminality is that liminal spaces and the internet's obsession with them have drowned out any discussion or idea of what the concept could be when applied to more than just some stupid yellowed rooms. Just let it die, it was never that deep. Silent Hill 2 takes just about all the groundwork laid by the first game and dials it up to the nth degree. The fog is back and used to even greater effect here, and the larger, more explorable town with heavier details. The familiar locations are even more intimate and disturbing this time around, and most importantly, we see how liminality can affect someone's mental state, as well as when it manifests beyond rooms and locations, and just how much it can be applied to people and creatures. I was able to hopscotch over most of the spoilers for the first game, but going forward with the rest of them, in order to fully discuss them, we're going to have to enter spoiler territory. So be warned, I'm going to spoil the absolute shit out of these games. To the risk of angering all the nerds in the audience, Silent Hill 1 is the most straightforward game of the original run. It's a miracle of ambition, hard work, and the right group of rejects being thrown into a room together, but compared to what came after it, in terms of its story, takes on psychological horror, and overall tone, it's definitely the most traditional game in the series, to say it nicely. And it's completely contrasted with Silent Hill 2, as it takes us back to the titular town, but this time not only is its layout completely different, but so is its approach to horror. The game's premise takes a far more personal and creeping approach than the overt cosmic horror style of its predecessor. Whereas Silent Hill 1 was more about our characters dealing with reality as they know it changing and being thrust into the unknown, Silent Hill 2 is much more subtle at first and actually has us take the role of a character who chooses to face the unknown in order to reconcile his inner demons, this time being what's actually manifesting the town. Gone is the cult and their Lovecraftian shenanigans, now only seen in references and callbacks. This time, we follow a character and explore a world inspired by Fyodor Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment and the film Jacob's Ladder, thus bringing a massive tonal shift into introspection rather than the typical Stephen King cultist affair of before. Our protagonist, James, comes to Silent Hill in search of his deceased wife after receiving a letter from her that she is still in the town waiting for him in their special place, already flipping the script of the first title by having our protagonist willingly walk into his story rather than be thrust into it beyond his control. The game tones down its other world, with most of the environments just being darker, rustier, and more off, but being toned down considerably, outside of maybe a handful of areas where it gets a little bit more kinky. Rather, the game focuses its liminality on its portrayal of enemies and characters. The entire cast this time around exists in their own threshold, a transitional place both metaphorically and literally, as they go back and forth from the other world and the real world and deal with the manifestations of their inner demons due to the experiences of their lives and the choices that they've made. This goes well beyond just James too. Each character we meet is experiencing their own unique journey and manifestations of them, because the creatures and overall look of each one is different. In the case of James though, his version of the town is flooded with distortions of femininity, fully sexualized and twistedly erotic. This is because James's arc is predicated on his lust, sexual frustration, and murderous tendencies. The whole revelation of the game is that James is a murderer. He committed matricide on his sick wife Mary, who spent a long time in the hospital deteriorating from a terminal illness, and neither Mary nor James handled it all that well. The growing tensions festered inside of James, causing him to seek out solace from alcohol, only deepening the pit he was digging for himself. And due to his wife's condition, any sexual or romantic needs were left behind, building up lust and anger that James felt. This is why every single enemy you meet within the game is a distorted form of femininity. The exaggerated busts and moans of the nurses simulate the urges James probably felt for them. And to bring liminality into the mix, much like a liminal space being a distorted visage of something we once knew as normal, this is the physical manifestation of the same principle applied to the female body. The previously mentioned nurses, the mannequins that are just a collection of legs, and even the first enemy we meet, James mistakes for Mary herself, a lurching and sick feminine figure with their ass fully hanging out. These creatures lay within the threshold of erotic and monstrous, evoking the uncanny valley as they sit there, or more so, the threshold of desire and consequence. Silent Hill 2's take on psychological horror plays directly into the liminal space of fantasy and reality. The fantasy James wants to escape to, where Mary is still alive and not rotting in the trunk of his car. And Pyramid Head, the only masculine manifestation we see in the town, serving as James' personal boogeyman and the guide through his journey to acceptance. He represents the punishment our protagonist feels he needs to get him through the threshold he's stuck in.
I was weak. That's why I needed you. Needed someone to punish me for my sins. But that's all over now.
There is far more than just this going on in Silent Hill 2, especially when we see how the town handles its other inhabitants like Angela or even Eddie. But those are stories for another day. Much like the first game, Silent Hill 2 uses its other elements to mess with the player. Predominantly its sound design, which is masterful. It's constantly jumping from quiet and creeping, only leaving your footsteps to fill the void. And allowing the noise to really disrupt and unsettle you when it shows up. But it also knows when to let silence carry the tension even further. Whatever James felt in that hole, let's just hope we never find out. The music takes all the liminal elements we've talked about thus far and puts it into audio form. Thor High Heels described it in a video about Akira Yamaoka in a way that couldn't be said any better.
This song swells. It breathes, if you will, filling your lungs with mist as you explore the empty town, feeling cold, desolate, yet still closely associated with living.
And this makes the atmosphere intense and extremely haunting. The music exists on a constant threshold of sounding beautiful and calming, and unsettling and ominous. Not to mention the extreme melancholy that coats every note played. Sometimes it's very subtle. Other times it's right in your face. It all pushes the liminal qualities and makes the game what it is, all the more tangible to the player, keeping them trapped in the threshold of the game in every element up until the final scene plays. Silent Hill 3 is where things really start to get far out there, and I mean that in the best way possible. The series' third entry is my favorite, so maybe I'm just a bit biased here, but it takes all the best elements of the previous two games and puts them together to create one of the best horror games ever made, as well as one of the most liminal experiences you can find in gaming. Silent Hill 3 is the true sequel to the first game, picking the story up over a decade later and thrusting us into the role of Heather Mason, the adopted daughter of Harry, who escaped Silent Hill with a baby. Heather is the reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie, and as such is destined to be the most integral figure to the cult. The game's take on liminality this time around is similar to its storytelling and gameplay. It's a marriage between the major elements of the first two games, retaining mental manifestations of introspections like in 2, all while portraying the physical embodiment and architectural aspects of liminal spaces we saw in the first title. In the entire series, I think Silent Hill 3 handles architectural nightmares and more traditional takes on liminal spaces the best. Just the first area of the game, the mall, plays this up expertly, a location all of us have been to at some point in our lives in a mostly modern format, yet abandoned and hollow. It's very reminiscent to the feeling you get when you watch the abandoned mall videos that you can see here on YouTube. A place designed to be heavily inhabited and crowded, left to sit in a darkened and empty state, really scratching that liminal space itch. And with the location being one so intimately familiar to the player, it allows it to feel all the more wrong and eerie, only for it to hit even harder when it begins to warp into the other world, this time not being so toned down. Heather's world is hellish and contorted, drenched in blood and rust. It's psychedelic and disgusting, but in an extremely interesting way. And the way that it uses liminal spaces to add onto its horror is absolutely fantastic. It all plays into the protagonist as well by exemplifying the exaggerated ways that a teenager would perceive the situations and events that this game puts you through. But what really makes the liminal qualities of Silent Hill 3 stand out is that Heather's journey feels much less like we are traversing back and forth through two worlds in a town, and much more like a deep, cavernous descent, deeper and deeper into purgatory, perverting normal and familiar locations into uncanny nightmares. It starts off relatively normal in the mall, as it becomes a bit of a typical visage of a Silent Hill location, only for its colors and darkness and distortions to ramp up with each new area, like the subway, the office, the sewer, and especially the amusement park, which in my opinion is the apex of both the game's level design and its liminal qualities, leaning heavily into the dreamlike aspects of the series. And this is also quite literal, as the game starts with Heather dreaming of this location, coming face to face with monsters as she walks through the nightmarish void of what once was a fun, cute theme park that parents used to take their kids. All the fun and whimsical nature has been completely flushed, replaced with a harsh and unrelenting sense of impending dread, with danger hidden around every corner, bottomless pits, monsters, and even rides hell-bent on taking you out. The reason I call it the peak is that it feels like here we finally passed through the threshold, with the entire game being a back and forth between the real and otherworld. The amusement park acts as a point of no return, where we find ourselves fully engulfed in the nightmare. But I did mention introspection still being an element here, so let's not waste any more time. It's not as consistently direct in the way that Silent Hill 2 is with James, rather it's a lot more subtle, and only shows its face at certain times. James's journey leaned far more into this, but its focus was almost fully on his life choices, and more specifically the one that led him back to the town to face his inner demons, where Heather's story is intertwined with destiny and her run from it, due to the connections that she has with the cult. As her story unfolds and she descends deeper into the abyss of the otherworld, she's consistently shown to be watched, whether it be by her sister or the otherworldly beings her soul is tied to, and it all revolves around the awkward yet all too familiar threshold of age. These elements are shown mostly within bosses and big character moments. Heather herself is 17, on the cusp of adulthood, and as such, she's caught in the threshold between childhood and adulthood, and the many fears, pains, and changes that come with it. Sometimes it's more subtle. The mirror room is a perfect example of this. It's easy to see this as just a scary moment where the town and its influence possesses Heather, but if we look at it more critically, we can also see these shifting and changes as a representation of how Heather herself is shifting and changing. I know some fans will just see this as a representation of Alessa, considering our showdown with her at the merry-go-round, but when paired with some of the earlier encounters, like the subtle as a sack of bricks penis monster, I think it's pretty easy to put two and two together and see these manifestations as Heather struggling with coming into adulthood, her fear of changing, and in the case of the penis monster, her fear of sex and even her own fertility. This comes to full fruition as it's revealed that Heather is not just the embodiment of Alessa, but is also carrying the fetus that will birth God, playing out to a haunting conclusion in the game's final confrontation.
God is... Claudia! Lesser, you cannot kill God. I will burn God. If you can't do it, Lesser, I will.
Silent Hill 3 not only takes the physical aspect of distorted creatures in liminal spaces, but here uses the threshold of puberty and youth. And again, much like the second game, there's far more going on here than just its liminal elements, like the aspects of destiny, the cult, and the idea that our gears might be being turned by something other than just us. But if we dug into those aspects, we would be here for hours. Each of these titles contains so much to sink your teeth into, and things that only make everything you experience all the more twisted, surreal, and terrifying. Silent Hill 3 indulges the most in environmental storytelling and corruption of our perceptions, letting us experience some of the most mind-bending liminal spaces one could find in gaming, and allowing the rusty, tetanus-soaked atmosphere to overtake us like nothing else. But outside of just the environments and introspective elements, much like the second game, its music and sound design do a lot of heavy lifting to carry us, helping to bring it all to life. And as you can hear, it also contains a more youthful quality to it, much like our protagonist Heather. And given the era it came out in, these softer rock elements play into some of the more popular sounds in music at the time, making the game's threshold between comforting and safe to horrific and dangerous all the more jarring and drastic, much like the hormonal shifts we feel as teenagers. Out of all the games, Silent Hill 3 sits at the top as my favorite, so I won't spoil any more of the game, as that's a topic I'd like to discuss in a video of its own. Before I get into it, let me just set up a bit of a premise for you. Imagine you're a homebody, or more so, a bit of a shut-in. The alien and cold nature of the outside world fills you with anxiety and dread, so you opt to stay in the comfort of your own home. But one day you wake up, a prisoner of your own solitude, and gradually, that once safe and comforting place begins to shift, changing into a far more hostile place. Subtle at first, only to become outright deadly to spend time in. That would be one of the most intense and harrowing experiences that one could endure. And that is a major center point to the premise of Silent Hill 4. The room is the black sheep of the franchise, and the most divisive entry of its original run. Originally devised as a spin-off game, not even directly related to Silent Hill, it would end up becoming the fourth title. And because of this, from the ground up, the room takes a much different formula and feeling than what came before. But funnily enough, it's probably the most direct in terms of having us experience liminality and being forced to go through a journey through the threshold the game has for us. Harry's apartment is the main setting of the game, and where most of its takes on liminality unfold. The room itself carries a similar feeling to images like this. because it fits the mold of that familiar setting we all know, but just a little too much that it feels uncanny. And with its dusty and neglected appearance, it sinks even further into that liminal space aesthetic, giving just our main setting an instantly uncomfortable and odd connotation. Even its story is far different than anything we experienced in the past. Rather than our protagonist surviving his way through a journey of introspection at the hands of a haunted town, the room tells the tale of Henry, a timid shut-in who doesn't even live in the titular town. Rather, Henry has the unfortunate fate of being roped into it, waking up to find himself locked in his apartment randomly and suffering from nightmares. A bit of a return to form in a way, as, like the first game, we're being thrust into the unknown against our will. As puzzling and horrible of a fate as this is, though, it's also one that comes with an even more terrifying conundrum: boredom. Initially, Henry passes his time by creepily peeping on his neighbor Eileen and hoping the ultimately failed attempts of his property manager will set him free. But on day 5, to no avail, a hole appears, and when crawled through, rather than freedom, Henry finds himself in the twisted hellscapes of the other world. Here we see the liminal spaces that we've come accustomed to in the series, perverting more familiar locations and showing off some new ones. But unlike the previous titles, this is far from the interesting aspect of Silent Hill 4's liminality. Rather, here, it's mostly the apartment itself. The titular room, which is 302, becomes more and more nightmarish and twisted as the game progresses. Henry's safe haven turned prison slowly transforms into a dangerous hellscape, once again presenting us with a threshold that each game places us in. And what helps hook us is the fact that the game is extremely hard and pretty bullshitty at times, with the hardest combat and most frustrating enemies we've faced thus far, and a less than stellar escort mission that takes up a good portion of the game. The frustrating nature of all of this causes us to want to stay in the room, the only truly safe place in the game. But as it goes on, it stops being that safe little haven that we've come to know, and by the halfway point, it becomes fully corrupted and filled with hauntings and anomalies. It makes the game's liminality so powerful because it forces us to face the terror that comes with change, taking a once safe location into a dangerous environment to just exist in, going full circle to the discomfort we feel about liminal spaces. Considering many of these locations, while not seeming outwardly dangerous, would also not be the safest places to exist in. The room also plays into the liminal elements of distorting familiar forms to great effect, like the famous face scare, or my personal favorite enemy reveal in just about any game, the twin victims. But hey, we're retreading a bit of familiar ground to what we've already covered with 1, 2, and 3. So let's not spend too much time on this. I won't lie to you and say that the room is as polished and cohesive as its predecessors. The criticism it gets is honestly a bit well deserved, and in many ways, its ideas and experimentations were taken to create what is quite possibly the scariest and most uncomfortable horror experience ever made. That being PT.
We regret to report the murder of a wife and her 2 children by their husband and father. The father purchased the rifle used in the crime at his local gun store 2 days earlier. This brutal killing took place while the family was gathered at home on a Sunday afternoon. the day of the crime, the father went to the trunk of his car, retrieved the rifle, and shot his wife as she was cleaning up the kitchen after lunch.
It's been said 1,000 times at this point, yet the point still stands. PT is absolutely terrifying, and its heart lies within Silent Hill 4 and its framework. Walking your way through an old living space, getting accustomed and familiar with its intricacies. And each nook and cranny, with the dread and terror kicking in subtly as you notice the small ways in which it shifts. Occasionally, you might be jolted with a jump scare. You walk through the threshold of normalcy to a liminal hellscape. As each passage through the hall leads to more changes, degradation, and hauntings, all while being quietly stalked by the malicious monstrosity who seeks to do you harm. It does just about everything the Backrooms seeks to, but without the baggage of memes and random lore needed to justify its existence. And in many ways, Silent Hill 4 and PT handle liminality better than just about any other piece of media. I guess what I've been trying to get at this entire video is, I fucking love Silent Hill. And with all the discussions I've seen of it over the years, as well as people talking about liminal spaces, or even just the concept of liminality itself, I haven't really heard anyone bring the two up together, and it's strange because it feels like one of the driving forces in bringing that entire concept to life had been ignored. Now, look, there are plenty of other games that take on similar themes and approach them even more directly than Silent Hill does, but Silent Hill still stands as the best in my opinion. Maybe it's how it combines these elements with the plethora of other themes, aesthetics, and concepts buried within the series. Or maybe it's just how it takes the idea of liminality and applies it to all sorts of other things besides just rooms. The creature design in these games is praised for very good reason, and that's because they really get at you in a way that feels much more personal and real. The heart and soul that went into each title with their unique takes on horror and twisted stories, they just stand above the rest in terms of not just their quality, but even their intention. Hopefully, as time goes on, more developers take notes on how this series handled liminality, and we can see it pushed even further. But with all that being said, subscribe, support me on Patreon, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.